7:23 a.m., March 18, 1943. Captain Heinrich von Raven stood at the crossroads near El Guettar, Tunisia, his hands raised in surrender. Before him stood 12 American soldiers from the 1st U.S. Infantry Division, their rifles trained on him. Sergeant William Patterson cautiously approached, his Thompson submachine gun leveled. "You're a prisoner of war now, Jerrys. Hands up, higher." Von Raven offered a weary smile, the perfect image of a defeated German officer. He wore a torn uniform, was unshaven, and had blood on his left shoulder from a superficial wound he'd inflicted himself. He looked like a man who'd just survived a lost battle. But Sergeant Patterson had no idea this man was here intentionally, that this surrender was perfectly planned, that over the next 754 days, von Raven would carry out the most successful espionage operation of World War II, right from the heart of the Allied prisoner of war camps. Heinrich von Raven was no ordinary officer. Born on September 3, 1912, in Hamburg, the son of a naval diplomat, he spoke fluent English, French, and Arabic. His father had served 15 years as a German naval attaché in London. From 1925 to 1930, Heinrich attended Westminster School in London. He spoke English with a perfect British accent. He knew British culture, sports, politics. He could discuss cricket for hours. He'd even played for the school team. In 1933, he joined the German Armed Forces, not because he was a Nazi, but because he wanted to be a soldier. His talent for languages was quickly recognized. In 1937, he was recruited into the German military intelligence under Admiral Canaris. 5 years of specialized training, false identities, interrogation techniques, psychological manipulation, information gathering, codes and ciphers. He became one of the best. In January 1943, Colonel Friedrich von Bechtolsheim, chief of the German Military Intelligence North Africa Division, summoned him to Tunis. The strategic situation was desperate. The Desert Fox was retreating. The Allies were advancing from the east and west. Germany needed intelligence about Allied plans. Von Bechtolsheim had a bold plan, Operation Trojan Horse. A German officer would deliberately allow himself to be captured. He would infiltrate the prisoner of war camps. He would gather information from careless Allied soldiers, from conversations between prisoners, from newspapers, from everything. The mission would last for months, perhaps years. The officer would be alone. No support, no rescue, only total dedication to the deception. Von Bechtolsheim had personally selected von Raven. "You have the skills. You speak perfect English. You can think like a Brit. But this mission will destroy you. If you are discovered, there will be no court-martial. Spies are shot. Are you ready to take this risk?" Von Raven didn't hesitate for a second. "I'm ready." The preparation took 6 weeks. An entirely new identity was created. Captain Heinrich von Raven would die. First Lieutenant Klaus Zimmermann, 5th Panzer Regiment, 21st Panzer Division, would be born. Zimmermann was a fictional officer, but his backstory was perfect. Real unit movements, real battles. A history that was verifiable if the Allies cross-referenced his statements with other prisoners. Von Raven had to memorize everything about Klaus Zimmermann. Date of birth, April 12, 1914. Place of birth, Munich. Father, Josef Zimmermann, a pharmacist. Mother, Anna Zimmermann, died in 1937. No siblings. Education, Realschule Munich, then German Armed Forces in 1935. Promotions, Lieutenant in 1938, First Lieutenant in 1941. Units, 7th Panzer Regiment, 1935-1940, then 5th Panzer Regiment, North Africa, 1941. He had to know this information so perfectly that he would never mix it up, even under stress, under interrogation, under sleep deprivation. German military intelligence even created fake personal items. A letter from a fictitious fiancée named Greta in Munich. A photo of a woman who was actually a German military intelligence agent in Berlin. A diary with 3 months of fabricated entries. A rosary from his supposedly deceased mother. Every detail perfect, every detail verifiable. At 11:30 p.m. on March 17, 1943, von Raven was driven in a staff car 40 kilometers behind German lines. He wore Zimmermann's uniform. He carried Zimmermann's dog tags. He carried a Walther P38 with 3 rounds of ammunition. He had a superficial shoulder wound that a medic had surgically and precisely inflicted. Deep enough to bleed, superficial enough not to cause permanent damage. At 6:50 a.m. on March 18th, he walked into American lines. The initial capture was crucial. Von Raven had to look tired, defeated, traumatized. He hadn't slept for 36 hours to appear naturally exhausted. He hadn't shaved for 3 days. His uniform was rubbed with desert sand. When the Americans saw him, he looked like a German officer who had just survived a week in hell. The first interrogation took place in a tent near Elgwetar at 2:30 p.m. on March 18th. Captain Robert Henderson, U.S. Army Intelligence, a professional interrogation specialist. Henderson asked 347 questions in 4 hours. Name, unit, rank. Where were you stationed? When were you wounded? What orders did you have? Von Raven answered perfectly. Every answer matched Zimmermann's story. Every answer was verifiable. Henderson wrote in his report, "Prisoner appears cooperative. No signs of deception. Ordinary tank officer. Low priority for further interrogations." That was exactly what von Raven wanted, to be invisible. An ordinary prisoner of war among thousands. No one interesting, no one who deserved attention. On March 22nd, he was transported to POW Camp 23 in Algeria, 2,400 German prisoners of war. The conditions were harsh, but not brutal. The Geneva Convention was generally followed. Food was scarce, but sufficient. Accommodations were tents. The guard personnel were professional. Von Raven's first task was integration. He had to be accepted by the other German prisoners. He had to make friends, gain trust, but not be too conspicuous. He carefully chose who he spoke with. Older, non-commissioned officers, experienced soldiers, men who had seen a lot and liked to tell stories. One of these men was Sergeant Otto Kraus, 47 years old, a veteran since 1914. Kraus had served in both world wars. He hated the Nazis, but loved Germany. He was wise, respected, and spoke with everyone. Von Raven became his friend. They played chess, they discussed politics. Kraus trusted him. And through Kraus, von Raven got to know the entire social network of the camp. The information gathering began slowly. Von Raven listened. He asked no direct questions. He let others speak. German prisoners constantly talked about what they had seen before being captured. Allied troop movements, tank types, artillery positions, Air Force bases. Each conversation was a small piece of information. 100 conversations created a picture. But the real gold came from the guards. American and British soldiers guarding the camp became careless. They talked to each other where prisoners could hear. They discussed news. They read newspapers aloud. They played the radio. Von Raven learned that American troops were preparing for an invasion of Europe. He heard the name Sicily mentioned several times. He heard guards discussing new M4 Sherman tanks arriving in Great Britain. He heard rumors of a massive bomber attack on German cities planned for the summer of 1943. The challenge was transmission. How could he send this information to Germany? German military intelligence, the Abwehr, had a plan. A network of contacts in neutral countries, Spanish diplomats, Swiss businessmen. Every prisoner of war was allowed to send mail, according to the Geneva Convention. 2 letters per month. Each letter was read by Allied censors. But the Abwehr had developed codes invisible to censors, hidden in seemingly harmless sentences. Von Raven's first encrypted message went out on April 15, 1943, a letter to his fictional fiancée, Greta, in Munich. The letter sounded like a normal love letter. "I miss you so much. The days here are long. I think of our last walk in the Englischer Garten. Do you remember the 12 swans on the lake? I hope the apple trees at your house are blooming beautifully this year. Yours, Klaus." But each sentence had a second meaning. Englischer Garten meant British troops. 12 swans meant the 12th US Army Corps. Apple trees meant artillery. Blooming meant mobilization. The message, decoded, said, "British and American troops, 12th Corps, mobilizing artillery for operation in the Mediterranean. Probable target, Sicily." The letters went to Greta's address in Munich, but Greta did not exist. The address was an Abwehr front office. Each letter was immediately decoded and forwarded to military intelligence. The system worked perfectly. The Allied censors only saw a lonely soldier writing to his fiancée. The code itself was ingenious in its simplicity. The Abwehr had called it the flower system. Each flower meant a type of weapon. Roses were tanks, tulips were artillery, lilies were infantry, orchids were the Air Force, colors signified nationality. Red roses were American tanks, white roses were British tanks. Numbers were hidden in seemingly harmless contexts. "I saw 12 red roses in the garden today," meant 12 American tank divisions observed. And places were coded through personal memories. The Englischer Garten in Munich meant England. The Französischer Dom in Berlin meant France. An Italian restaurant in Hamburg meant Italy. Nordbahnhof meant Norway. The codes were flexible enough for new information, but structured enough for consistent translation. Von Raven even developed an urgency system. Normal letters began with "My dearest Greta." Urgent information began with "My beloved Greta." Critical information began with "My only Greta." The Abwehr knew how important each letter was, even before they decoded it. The system had only one weakness. It was based on human judgment. Von Raven had to decide what was important enough to report. He rarely made mistakes, but he was only one man. He couldn't see everything. He couldn't know everything. Sometimes he sent information that proved unimportant. Sometimes he missed critical details because he didn't recognize their significance. In June 1943, von Raven was shipped to England with 800 other prisoners to POW Camp 174 in Yorkshire. This was even better for intelligence. England was the center of Allied war planning. Von Raven observed everything: airplane movements, military convoys on nearby roads, troop transports on railways. Camp 174 had a library. Prisoners were allowed to read British newspapers, 2 weeks old. Von Raven read every article, political speeches, economic reports, factory production. Every piece of information was valuable. He had a photographic memory. He memorized numbers, names, dates. Then he encrypted them into his harmless letters. His second major challenge was avoiding suspicion. There were German officers in the camp who were fanatical Nazis. They organized secret meetings. They tried to maintain discipline. They considered cooperation with the Allies to be treason. Von Raven had to balance carefully. He couldn't be too friendly with the guards. That would arouse suspicion, but he couldn't be too isolated either. That would make him stand out. He developed a persona. First Lieutenant Zimmermann was tired of the war. He was done with fighting. He was polite but distant. He followed camp rules. He never complained. He was the perfect, invisible prisoner. Exactly what he needed to be. In September 1943, something dangerous happened. A new German prisoner arrived at Camp 174, Lieutenant Werner Scholz, actually from the 5th Panzer Regiment, the same unit where Zimmermann had supposedly served. Von Raven had to be extremely careful. If Scholz asked questions about people in the unit, about places, about events, the wrong answer could reveal everything. The Abwehr had foreseen this. Von Raven's backstory was constructed so that Zimmermann had served in a different battalion of the same regiment. Their paths would have rarely crossed. When Scholz asked, "Did you know Major Hartmann?" Von Raven could honestly say, "I heard the name, but we never met. My battalion was mostly stationed 40 kilometers to the south." Scholz accepted this. It made sense in a large unit. By the end of 1943, von Raven began to gather more important intelligence. Guards talked about Operation Overlord. They didn't mention the name, but they talked about a massive invasion of France planned for 1944. Von Raven heard date speculations. He heard discussions about landing zones. Normandy was mentioned. Calais was mentioned. He sent everything to Germany. His reports reached the High Command of the German Armed Forces, the Wehrmacht. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, received several of von Raven's reports. They confirmed other intelligence. The Allies were definitely planning an invasion of northern France. The only question was where and when. But von Raven's most valuable intelligence didn't come from military secrets. It came from morale and production. He reported that Allied soldiers were highly motivated, that American industrial production was incredible, that every month he saw more new tanks, more airplanes, more ammunition. This information was depressing for Germany, but critically important for realistic war planning. The psychological strain of von Raven's mission was enormous. He was living as someone else, 24 hours a day. He had to be on guard every second. One wrong word, one wrong reaction, and it would all be over. He could trust no one. He was completely alone. The only people who knew his true identity were thousands of miles away. He developed techniques to mentally survive. Every morning, he silently recited his real identity. "I am Heinrich von Raven, born in Hamburg, September 3rd, 1912. This helped him remember who he really was. At night, he sometimes dreamed that he was Zimmermann, and von Raven was the deception. He would wake up confused, unsure which identity was real. The isolation was the worst. He couldn't have real friendships, because every friendship was based on a lie. When Krauss talked about his family, about his hopes, about his fears, von Raven couldn't truly respond. Everything he said had to fit Zimmermann's story. His real thoughts, his real feelings had to remain hidden. It was like living in a glass box. He could see the world, but couldn't truly touch it. There were moments when the mask almost slipped. In August 1943, he received news that Hamburg had been bombed. Operation Gomorrah. 42,000 civilians dead. His family lived in Hamburg. He didn't know if they had survived. He wanted to scream, to weep, to despair. But Zimmermann's family was in Munich. Zimmermann had no reason to be concerned about Hamburg. Von Raven had to appear indifferent while his heart was breaking. He went to bed early that evening, lay in his bunk, his face to the wall, and wept silently. For 2 hours, no one saw, no one knew. 3 weeks later, at the end of August, a letter came through the Red Cross. His mother was alive. His father was alive. The house was destroyed, but they were safe, with relatives in Lübeck. Von Raven felt relief, so intense that he almost collapsed. But he couldn't tell anyone. He couldn't share this joy. Zimmermann had just received a letter from his fictional fiancée. That was all that others were allowed to see. Another dangerous moment came in October 1943. A new German prisoner, First Lieutenant Hans Becker, allegedly recognized von Raven. "You know me, don't you? We met in Berlin in 1939 at a German military intelligence briefing. You were Captain von Raven." Von Raven's blood ran cold. Becker was confused, maybe head trauma, maybe a real memory. Von Raven had to act quickly. He laughed. "My name is Zimmermann, not von Raven. I've never been to Berlin. You're mistaking me for someone else." Becker seemed unsure. Maybe I was mistaken. Sorry." But Becker looked at von Raven strangely. For weeks afterward, von Raven avoided him completely. Fortunately, Becker was transferred to another camp in December. The danger was over, but it showed how dangerous a single coincidence could be. Sergeant Krauss became his emotional anchor. Krauss was real, honest, human. They played chess almost every evening. They talked about philosophy, about hopes for after the war, about grief for lost comrades. Von Raven felt real friendship for Krauss, but he was lying to Krauss's face. Every day, this cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. In March 1944, exactly 1 year after his capture, von Raven became depressed. He wondered if the mission was worth it, whether the information he was gathering was really influencing the war, whether he could ever return to Germany, whether anyone would ever know the truth. But he kept going, duty over emotion. That was what he had learned. He was a soldier, he had a mission, he would complete it until the end. May 1944 brought intense activity. All around the camp, von Raven saw military preparation, hundreds of tanks on railroad cars, thousands of trucks, endless convoys. The invasion was coming soon. Von Raven wrote his most urgent letter: massive troop movements. Estimate 40 to 50 divisions, gathering southwest of London, invasion probably within 4 to 6 weeks, target area uncertain, but activity concentrated on the southern coast. On June 6, 1944, the invasion of Normandy began. Von Raven heard guards cheering, "We did it! We're in France! We're winning this war!" He felt simultaneously despair for Germany and respect for the Allied achievement. The invasion was militarily brilliant. The logistics were incredible. Germany couldn't win against such power. After the invasion, von Raven's work became more difficult. The Allies were more paranoid about security. Fewer newspapers, stricter censorship. Guards spoke less openly, but he was still gathering valuable information about troop types, new weapons, supply problems. In September 1944, von Raven made a mistake, a tiny mistake, but almost fatal. He was talking to a new British watch officer, First Lieutenant David Morrison. Morrison mentioned that he had played cricket in Kent. Von Raven, forgetting that Zimmermann knew nothing about cricket, said, "I saw a match in Kent in 1929. Splendid stadium." Morrison stared at him. "You were in England in 1929. I thought you were German." Von Raven's heart raced. He improvised, quickly. "Sorry, I meant I read about a match in Kent in a newspaper here. My English isn't so good. I mix up words." Morrison seemed unsure, but accepted the explanation. It was a narrow escape. Von Raven was paralyzed by fear. For a week, he avoided Morrison completely. Afterward, but Morrison had become suspicious. He reported it to Captain Thomas Fletcher, the camp security officer. Fletcher began watching von Raven. Nothing obvious, just subtle surveillance. Fletcher noticed that Zimmermann spoke perfect English. Better than most German officers, Fletcher noticed that Zimmermann wrote a lot of letters, 2 per month, the maximum allowed, always to the same address in Munich. Fletcher began reading the letters more carefully. They seemed harmless, love letters to a fiancée. But Fletcher had experience in intelligence work. Something felt wrong. The letters were too perfect, too romantic, too emotional for a panzer officer who was supposed to be a hardened soldier. In November 1944, Fletcher requested help from MI5, the British Domestic Intelligence Service. He sent all of Zimmermann's letters. MI5 had code breakers. German codes had been largely broken since 1941. But these letters used no known code. They tried statistical analysis, letter frequency, word patterns, nothing. But then, an analyst named Patricia Thornton looked at the letters differently. She wasn't looking for code. She was looking for steganography. Hidden messages, in seemingly normal text. She noticed patterns. Certain words appeared with unusual frequency. Hyde Park, apple trees, swans, always connected with numbers. Thornton created a list. Every time a specific word appeared, she noted the context. She began to see correlations. Hyde Park appeared in letters written before British troop movements. Apple trees before artillery deployments. Swans before American units. On December 3, 1944, Thornton wrote a report. I believe prisoner of war Zimmermann is a German spy. His letters contain encrypted intelligence, recommend immediate arrest and interrogation. On December 8, 1944, at 6:15 a.m., von Raven was pulled from his bunk by 6 MPs, handcuffs, not a word spoken. He knew immediately it was over. 632 days. The deception had lasted 632 days, almost 2 years. But now, it was over. He was taken to a separate building, interrogation room. Captain Fletcher was waiting. With him was Major Robert Stevens, an MI5 interrogation specialist, famous for breaking German spies. Stevens looked at von Raven and said, "Who? Are you really?" Von Raven had 2 options, continue lying or confess. He chose dignity over deception. He said, in perfect English with a slight British accent, "My name is Heinrich von Raven, Captain, Abwehr. I deliberately surrendered on March 18, 1943, for an intelligence mission. The next 3 days were intense interrogation. Stevens wanted to know everything. How was the operation planned? How were the codes transmitted? What information had he sent? Von Raven cooperated completely. There was no point in fighting anymore. The war was almost over. Germany would lose. He could at least end with honor. Stevens was impressed, despite himself. He wrote in his report, "Von Raven is the most professional German agent we have interviewed. His deception was nearly perfect. His codes were elegant. His information gathering was efficient. If not for a tiny mistake about mentioning cricket, we might never have discovered him. This shows the quality of German intelligence training." The British government faced a question. What to do with von Raven? Technically, he was a spy. Spies could legally be shot. But he was wearing a uniform when he surrendered. He followed the rules of warfare. His codes didn't violate the Geneva Convention, because letters were his legal right. Winston Churchill personally decided von Raven would not be shot. He would be kept in solitary confinement until the end of the war. Then he would return to Germany. as a regular prisoner of war. Churchill saw no value in creating martyrs. Von Raven spent the last 5 months of the war in solitary confinement in a high-security prison in Scotland. He had no contact, no letters, no information, just silence and isolation. It was almost a relief after 2 years of constant deception. On May 14th, 1945, 6 days after Germany's surrender, he was released into the regular prisoner of war camp. Sergeant Krauss was there. When Krauss saw von Raven, he embraced him. "My friend." "Where have you been? I thought you were dead." Von Raven told one last lie. "I was sick, typhus. They isolated me." Krauss believed him. They played chess. That evening, von Raven could never tell him the truth. That last game with Krauss was strangely emotional for von Raven. He knew that he would probably never see this man again. Krauss, who had been a true friend, despite the deception. Krauss, who had shown him humanity in an inhumane situation. Von Raven wanted to tell the truth. He wanted to confess, but that would hurt Krauss. It would show him that their entire friendship was based on a lie. So von Raven remained silent. Some truths are too painful to be spoken. They played until midnight. Krauss won with checkmate in 47 moves. They shook hands. Von Raven went to sleep, knowing that he had cheated Krauss out of something real that still had to be a lie. In September 1945, von Raven was repatriated to Germany. He returned to Hamburg. His family was still alive. The house was damaged by bombs, but standing. His mother cried when she saw him. His father hugged him for 5 minutes without words. Von Raven was never publicly acknowledged for his mission. The Abwehr no longer existed. Most records were destroyed. Only a few people knew what he had done. He never spoke about it publicly. He lived a quiet life. He worked as a translator. He married in 1948. He had 2 children. He died in 1987 at 75 years old. But the British intelligence services never forgot him. MI5 kept his files classified until 2002. When they were released, historians were amazed. A perfect espionage operation, a nearly impossible deception, a man who was a completely different person for 2 years. The information that von Raven sent influenced German strategy. His reports about the upcoming Normandy invasion reached the high command, but Hitler believed it was a deception. He thought the real attack would come at Calais. Von Raven's accurate intelligence was ignored. That's the tragedy. He risked everything. He sacrificed 2 years of his life. He lived in constant fear. And in the end, his information was ignored by the men who needed it most. Patricia Thornton, the MI5 analyst who discovered him, was later asked, "How did you feel when you realized you had found a German spy?" She answered, "Respect. I felt respect. Von Raven was an enemy, but he was a professional. He served his country with extraordinary courage, the ability to live a false identity every moment of the day for 2 years requires a mental strength that I can barely imagine." Captain Fletcher wrote a private letter to von Raven in 1967. He had found his address through veteran connections. The letter said, "I fought against you during the war. I helped capture you, but I wanted you to know you were the most worthy opponent I ever met." His operation was brilliant. In another time, under different circumstances, we could have been friends. Von Raven never wrote back, but he kept the letter until his death. Modern intelligence training uses von Raven's operation as a case study. The CIA, MI6, Mossad, they all study what he did, how he built an identity, how he gathered information without raising suspicion. how he survived mentally. His techniques are still taught today. These aren't just statistics from dusty archives. These are the moments that define courage in a different way. Not the courage to fight, the courage to deceive, the courage to live a lie, every second for 754 days, the courage to be completely alone, surrounded by enemies who would kill you if they knew the truth. If these historical truths matter to you, support with the golden heart below. Every super thanks allows me access to declassified MI5 files, to record interviews with veterans, to preserve these forgotten stories of human excellence. The story of Heinrich von Raven shows us that intelligence is a weapon as powerful as any bomb. That mental strength can be more important than physical strength. That a single man, with nothing but his intelligence and his courage, can carry out a 2-year operation that serves his country and impresses his enemies. 2 years, 754 days, 18,096 hours. Every second a deception, every second the risk of discovery. That's a form of courage that's rarely recognized, but should never be forgotten. What impressed you the most? The mental strength required to live as someone else for 2 years, the perfection of the preparation, the tragedy that his information was ignored? Share your thoughts. Many have written about family stories of intelligence and espionage. Each story is a window into a world most will never see. Share your stories below. Every comment honors men like von Raven, who fought in the shadows.